the mainstream media, that seems to be one narrative. So I've come to understand that it does come back to everyday people understanding each other. I think we're all ambassadors for ourselves and for each other. We have a higher purpose, whether we realize that or not. So I think in today's world, there's a lot of challenges in terms of information overload, social media. Try and take some of that space out to find out what's your purpose. It's a big question. Ask people that what's their purpose, but whatever that you enjoy, whatever good you want to see in the world, whatever legacy you want to live, you start to think about that, follow that. When things get difficult, or when things are good as well, just wake up in the morning thinking, that's that person I want to be today. That's what I want to achieve.
Hi, my name's Andrew Payne and welcome to Men on Show. And today I am so excited to have Nakhooda as our guest, Head of Organisational Development on the multi-billion-pound TransPennine Route Upgrade, Western Leeds. He's a multidisciplinary senior project and organisational development professional specialising in major complex infrastructure and urban regeneration programmes. He's also a British Muslim, and I'm so honoured to have him on the show to explore his experience as a man, his experience as a British Muslim man. So I'm so excited, Sol, to have you on the show today. Welcome to Men on Show.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. Well, look, just to get started, Sol, tell me about your life as a young Muslim boy and teenager living in Britain. What was life like for you?
Gosh, how long do we have? In summary, I come from a social, you'd class as a socially deprived area, but actually socially rich in so many aspects too, as I've come to understand as I've got older. And growing up in Britain, I was surrounded predominantly, it was sort of first generation migrant or second generation migrant area. And growing up in Britain, you definitely felt British, you felt English, you definitely had a strong background to whatever your ethnic roots are as well. And for some people, that's purely ethnic. For other people, that's usually a mix of actual multiple ethnicities. And sometimes that gets lost a little bit. So, for example, my family, whilst they originally come from, or say recently come from India, my sort of ancestors not too far back are a mix of Persian, from the Arab Levant, Central Asian. So there's a lot sort of going on there. And then they themselves have lived in East Africa, and my grandparents went to South Africa for a little while. So there's a lot sort of going on there, which you don't necessarily realize actually. Before you even understand yourself as you're growing up. And then there's a whole religious aspect, which certainly sort of in the 80s quite dominant. I think with people, I'm not sure how it is for kids nowadays in various areas, but I imagine it still is. So yeah, you've got to kind of get your head around all of that, but you don't necessarily know that you need to.
Yeah,
or
sure.
not necessarily the tools are available there. So it's quite exciting or challenging environment.
Well, what were some of the best bits? What do you remember that was just really great? You sort of treasured memories of that life, sort of growing up.
I think, and comparing sort of now to then, I think having that social and family network, that's the heartbeat of particularly South Asian, Middle Eastern communities. I think there's a lot of value to that, which you may not appreciate when you're younger. So that would be, we'd be at my grandparents on the weekend, my cousins, we would call them sort of brothers and sisters almost. And so we used to see them as opposed to cousins, and uncle and aunties, we used to see them almost as parents. And when I started to engage with people outside of the community, they were kind of like, well, that's your cousin. And we'd say, well, no, that's my cousin's brother, cousin sister. And actually, and we'd see second and third cousins as family.
Wow. Yeah.
So that was amazing. And the sort of informal kind of support networks that are there, the cultural side of things, and this kind of belonging. But at the same time, you've then got that strong belonging. But then when you're watching TV or the media, or you go out of the area and you think, oh, this is quite different, and then you've got to go, well, that's just completely different in some ways. And a lot of our school teachers were actually not from the subcontinent. There wasn't much diversity at school in terms of the teachers and the leadership of the teachers there. So that was interesting in terms of their dynamic or their understanding of what's going on and our understanding of them as well.
Interesting. And what would you say what do you see as like the biggest challenges? Were there growing up as a Muslim boy and sort of young Muslim man? Do you look back and see there are any particular challenges that you felt that you faced?
Yeah, so those sort of started to the back end of that response. I guess it's that, you know, the institutions, whoever the people are that are guiding your upbringing in terms outside of the family home, do they sort of understand your cultural ethic? Do they understand the nuances and complexity of that? And then that sort of then translates into, you know, things that we can almost take for granted now, which is a good thing, you know, understanding actually why Friday prayers are important, you know, why Ramadan is important. And there was a lot that was developing then, and we were part of that development. Sometimes you feel like, should I be saying that I need to leave a little bit early because I want to go and have dinner with my family, you know, I'm going to open my fast, or can I go to the mosque, particularly in this month for Friday prayers, maybe not other months, and how do I go about navigating all that? And with most of our parents being first generation immigrants, you know, some of them led a lot in terms of that front, and it just depended on what area you were from, what the relationship was in that community. So it's very sort of hit and miss rather than consistency across the board. And then in terms of the religion and culture, I think trying to actually understand what is the religion and what is the culture, because Islam is actually a very diverse religion. And I think then trying to think, well, okay, that's what's culturally expected of me, but that's religion. And sometimes that can get confused as you're growing up because you don't know your own mind yet, or you haven't had those experiences to reflect on that or what's going around you. So not necessarily something that's kind of you're told to do X, Y, Z, but when you're growing up, you're observing behaviors around you, and you think, well, where do I sit within this? And then you've got the media of the 80s, you know, big thing, you know, there in terms of what you see on TV. And I think it was a real kind of, I quite like to actually look back and think about all the sort of video games and movies and all the sort of popular shows that we enjoyed. And that is a totally different life, you know, that you see, usually quite American. You know, Home Alone, for example, you know, that big house with all the presents and, you know, but in some ways you can identify there's a large family there, isn't there? They're all going on holiday together. So you can identify with it, but then you think, actually, my house would not be like that, or that huge house, which actually probably most people don't actually have, you know, with all the sort of riches and the good quality of life there and some of the advantages of it, luxuries around that. You wouldn't necessarily have that yourself. And then you kind of think, well, you know, you're trying to navigate through all of that. So I think you kind of feel like, where do you belong? I think is a big one. I think that was a big challenge for many people, without them realizing or not. How do we fit into this? Where do we belong? What's expected actually of us, and how, you know, how do we want to shape it going forward? So all that is there as a context, but you don't necessarily know that that's all going on.
Sure. Because where roughly did you grow up? Just sort of roughly in the UK.
So I was born in London. I started off in East London, the council estate there. We then moved up to the Midlands.
Where were you roughly in the Midlands?
So it was Leicester.
Oh, Leicester. Okay, yeah. Not far. I'm based in Birmingham myself, so not too far. Yeah.
I moved to Birmingham after university, so familiar with Birmingham.
So,
but yeah, so it was, you know, obviously, if you know much about Leicester, very sort of thriving multicultural community, but then quite different to other Asian areas in other cities. But people wouldn't necessarily know that from looking on the outside.
No, absolutely.
So you go within that and think it might be the same in Birmingham or Leeds or Manchester or wherever. Actually, coming from there, you go to that area and think, this isn't what I recognise.
Right, interesting.
My people, my ethnic people, you know, and it's quite different. They have their own cultures, you know, the Bengali community or Pakistani community, or, you know, things are far more diverse now as well. You know, a lot of Kurdish people, you've had a lot of, I mean, fortunately, in terms of adding to diversity, or unfortunately, a lot of refugees from the Middle East and places like that as well coming over. So you've got a different landscape now.
Yeah. I was reading an article from the Muslim Council of Britain saying that nearly half of reports of religiously motivated hate crime is against Muslims in the UK. And particularly with recent events in Palestine, the incidence of hate crime against Muslims in London, for example, has gone up by 140%, which is really, really tragic and sad to hear. Did you feel that you experienced Islamophobia, some sense of that growing up? Did you recognize that as a younger man?
I think for me there was a definite sort of line in the sand with 9/11,
Okay,
um,
interesting.
where I think Islamophobia, as we know it today, started to accelerate. Prior to that, you wouldn't even know the phrase Islamophobia, right?
Yeah,
But it was there, but I think it was more subtle. Um, and when it happened, you probably maybe just saw it as racism or something like that. So, in terms of pre 9/11 growing up, it'd be more subtle in terms of perhaps even unconscious bias from your teachers, etc. So, one of my teachers actually I thought was fantastic, but he didn't actually have much aspiration for many of the kids in the class. Actually, only probably the real kind of high academic achievers and the ones that were just the best behaved. Which I was a high academic achiever, but I'm not sure I was the best behaved, Andrew. If I'm honest with you. So, I mean, his thing was, well, so what do you want to be when you go to grow up? Do you want to kind of go into selling cars or things like that? And actually, I had much higher hopes and ambitions than that. And I was absolutely nailing all my tests and school results. So that was interesting because that wasn't on any basis of, well, why not? Well, I wanted to be an architect at that time. Why not that? Why not some of those higher professions? Where's that coming from internally, type of thing? There's no reason to think why I would have been going down that route as opposed to a sort of more kind of senior. Not that there's anything wrong with that route, but it didn't really match what was
yeah,
actually happening on the ground. That kind of thing going up, and then um, in terms of direct Islamophobia, yeah, you'd be out in the town centre, for example, and it was quite segregated. Actually, I think things are a bit more mixed nowadays, but communities were quite segregated. So although even Leicester or other cities would say, well, we're quite diverse, but back in those days it was diverse only in those specific groups. You went to the city and mostly the Afro-Caribbean people lived in one area and the white people lived in a different area. The ethnically, so South continent kind of people lived in a different area. So when you'd venture out, you'd then get it from if there was a group of, let's say, white kids walking around, you have your mosque hat on or something like that. You would get bullied, or they would, in some instances we were robbed of our money and that type of thing. We used to have bricks and bottles and stones thrown at us on the way to the mosque, which we used to go for our learning in the evenings around religion and other areas, Arabic and things like that. You'd be, you'd say they'd call out names that you're wearing a skirt and that type of thing. So that kind of thing was there, but you just sort of accepted it because you thought, well, I am different. So you felt different. You definitely felt different because there was no kind of integration really there. So that kind of thing, and then post 9/11, that's when I certainly had this feeling of, oh no, they're going to think that's got something to do with me. And I say they,
yeah,
I mean the larger mainstream
yeah,
population, the media. You started seeing more in the media, things like that, and you think, oh, what does it mean for me? But I still have got nothing to do with that. I don't think anything about that. But most people I knew were just, actually everyone I knew were just wanted to do good in society and contribute in a positive way, going to the mosque and that type of thing. Um, I do actually remember going back when I was a child during the Iraq War. That's when it first really hit me, and you can probably class that as Islamophobia. So I went to school, and in our school was predominantly the same ethnic background, but they were Hindus. So it was really odd, Andrew, because actually you felt like spoke the same language, same mother tongue, ate very similar food, although we probably ate a bit more meat because we were Muslim. But actually, I found out afterwards. I thought Indian food actually was very kind of vegetarian food, and we used to throw meat on top, you know, type of thing. And I realized that afterwards. And you then felt an outsider within that own sort of community, in a sense. And actually, our parents who lived closer together, neighbors in East Africa, felt closer together and as part of one community than we did as, you know, kind of born and growing up in England. And I wasn't allowed, I remember he said to me, well, we're going to beat you. And he was in a Hindu religion, an Indian background. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you guys, you know, in terms of Saddam Hussein and Iraq War. And I thought, I'm not on their side. I don't really even know what's going on.
Yeah.
It's the first I heard of it, to be honest with you. And you know, and as you imagine, as kids, it kind of, you know, they started pushing me around and that type of thing. And wasn't, you know, it was more play fun, but actually, that was the first time I experienced that he saw me as on that side purely because of my religion.
Yeah. And you
And I
say it
thought I
was
haven't
more
done anything
play.
wrong, and you're putting,
Yeah. And you say
yeah,
it was more play, and you've referred to people calling out to you, you're wearing skirts, and you very much downplay that in terms of its
mm,
impact on you psychologically. But do you think it did impact you? Do you think that was, you know, that to me sounds really hard to deal with as a fella growing up, wanting to belong, wanting to feel like you're a man, to be faced with
yeah,
with mockery about who you are, about your culture. In that situation with Iraq, some sense of confusion. It's like, hang on, you're connecting me with like I've got nothing. Do you think that affected you, or do you think genuinely it was like it was not a major deal for you personally?
I think no doubt it would have affected a lot of people of my generation, my peers, no doubt, without question of doubt. But I think we were in that space then where you just had to get on with things. So you'd feel bad, and it probably did impact then, you know, my friendship with that individual or others, you know, or you know, when we used to go to town, we used to have to hide our money in our shoes and things like that. You know, we'd be more careful about what we did. So it would affect you, and you'd have some kind of anxiety or nervousness around things like that. But then there was resilience that comes out of it, as you probably know, with the good work that you do, Andrew, in terms of, you know, dealing with that and learning how to finding your own ways. And I'm sure that there's people that really struggled more than I did, perhaps. And I did struggle at points, you know, but that's probably made me more resilient now.
Sure.
And looking back, certainly it's kind of shaped who I am. But yeah, you wouldn't want that for any children at the time. Yeah,
Mm.
you would kind of, as I've explained, I was thinking, well, that's not me. That's not anything to do with me. Start thinking these things. Am I an outsider? You know,
Yeah.
yeah, and you'd be worried about going to the mosque. You know, they're talking about violence there when people throwing bricks and bottles at you and things like that. So you kind of go in groups. Sometimes you walk
Yeah.
together for a certain patch where you knew that there might be other kids
Yeah.
around and that type of thing, and then you'd kind of go off and walk on your own and that type of thing. So yeah, you know, you'd have that fear, but then I think we accepted it as this is the area we live in and this is what life is like. So you
Yeah.
need to get on with that. Yeah.
Yeah. And do you think it's worse today then? I mean, that's the question. Obviously, we've mentioned the Iraq War, where you've kind of noticed that it may have there was the outcome for you was sort of being teased a little bit about whose side's going to win. You mentioned 9/11 very specifically as something that, you know, there was almost like a date. Before 9/11, it was like just general bits and pieces of racism, not really conscious of it in that way. But like after 9/11, so talk after 9/11, therefore, what do you see more of? Is it a bigger problem? Islamophobia, you've seen that as a bigger problem, do you think?
Yeah, I do. I think, like I always say, I don't want to. I think the unconscious bias was definitely always there, or sometimes conscious bias. So some of the early jobs I had, you'd be, you know, be made to feel less welcome, perhaps, or you know, there'd be a social after work or whatever it might be, and sometimes you'd be included, sometimes you wouldn't, and you'd feel like an outsider. So that was already there, but I think what that did was bring it kind of out into the open, and I think the media then really started to the mainstream media, I think, until today, and we're seeing now with what's happening in Gaza, that unfortunately um, the mainstream media don't actually they portray a particular agenda,
Yeah.
um, and I think there's various understanding and reasons why that's currently happening. Um, and I think that definitely was become apparent. I mean, partly because also I was probably about 19 or 18 at the time, as I was probably more aware now and conscious of what's going on. Incidentally, there was an issue at the time. There was a Israel was doing one of its assaults on, I think it was Gaza at the time. You might remember there was a dad with a child, and he said, "Don't shoot." He was protecting his young child, and he was hiding behind a can or a bin or something like that. And then they still shot the dad. Or actually, sorry, they shot the child. They shot the child. I'm not sure whether they shot the dad as well. That, for me, really kind of hit home. And I was like, wow, there's you're led to kind of believe that the institutions around you, the government, etc., are there to protect you, and that we in the West are very democratic and protect everyone. Things are fair and equal. And in a lot of ways, we are. I know people, and I've been abroad quite a bit, and you see that we are. We've got great. But then when it comes to certain things like that, you think, well, it's not fair. I'll have your back. There was an innocent person that's clearly very innocent and that type of thing. And that started to, you then start to witness things like that. But one thing I did want to share was, and I think it was important, when that happened, I remember speaking to my dad and thinking, sharing some of how I felt, which was interesting because I imagine a lot of young lads and men, regardless of race, in those days, wouldn't probably talk to their dad that much about how they're feeling, and that type of thing, particularly at that age. And my dad said, and it was solid advice, I think. He said, "Do you know what the hardest thing is, son?" He said, "The hardest thing, people get carried away when these things happen. And sometimes they then respond negatively. And actually, the best thing that you can do as any human being is to focus on doing things well and having the best behavior. Because actually, if everybody did that cumulatively, people would just get along more, and they'd realize that what they're seeing on TV doesn't actually reflect back in the people that they know. And unfortunately, this is the case. When you do something wrong, that's going to be amplified. You do something good, I think that's just the way human psychology works anyway, isn't it? But I think particularly, he said, if you're from this sort of minority background, if you're Muslim, bad people go, "Well, you do that because you're a Muslim."
Yeah.
You don't necessarily, people don't necessarily say that about other religions or races or faiths or whatever. And they do it for some. And he made me aware of that. And that really stuck in my head. And I think that's been a big motivator of mine. It's actually harder to just live the day to day really well and treat people really well and contribute to society positively. And I think that sort of thread has then stayed with me all the way through. And I'd like to think then people then through their interactions with you go, "Well, actually, hold on, that's not what I see in real life." But I do think that media bias, I think in some ways we've seen with our governmental institutions that we should know and trust, not there all the time consistently for various groups, I think is actually quite a strong counteracting force in terms of that landscape of how people feel that culture is shaped. So that is, and I've felt that all the way through. Yeah.
I think we have a shocking ignorance here in the UK. I mean, you've described quite clearly how within the Muslim community within the UK that you grew up in, there is so much diversity, so many different communities within that one community. And I think often those of us that are not part of that community lose sight of that. I mean, it's fairly obvious, but we just need to remind ourselves that that is the case. And I was laughing at, well, not laughing. I mean, it's really not funny at all, but just at the shocking level of ignorance, even of Richard Madeley, TV presenter, going to be watched by millions of people. And when the politician for, she's not politician, the MP, for British Palestinian, Layla Moran, Liberal Democrat MP for Oxford, West and Abingdon, and she was on one of his programs worried about her family hiding out in a church in Gaza because of her family there. Richard Madeley genuinely asked her in all sincerity, "Well, did your family know, did you have prior knowledge of the Hamas attacks?" And she was like utterly bewildered. Just because of her family out there, he just made this assumption that maybe she would have known, she'd have had prior knowledge, and she sort of gasped, and she was actually wonderful in the way that she responded. She responded very intelligently and with great dignity to what was the most ridiculous, absurd, stupid, biased question. And it strikes me just how much ignorance there is, and
Hmm.
how do we create better understanding? I mean, I suppose it starts with the press actually reporting in a more intelligent manner, which would be a good start. But how do we create more intelligent debate so we understand and we've just got a more balanced view of what's actually going on out there?
So I studied politics at uni, despite my ambition to want to be an architect, and I studied politics um, because I'd been doing quite a bit of backpacking. I took a year out before university, and I understood more and more what's happening in the world around me. I didn't quite know what career I'm going to go in, but I thought I want to get my head around this. Um, and I knew someone who was on a similar course, who then inspired me a little bit as well to go on that course. I thought we'll take it from there. I know that I can do something with this, whether I end up working, with the UN or whether I work for an NGO abroad doing some good or whatever it might be. And what I came to understand, we studied the Cuban Revolution quite a bit, and what I come to understand is that the the government institutions, the Western media, particularly in the way that we live at this moment, with globalization, with a lot of large sort of corporations, very sort of elitist people at the top, kind of control a lot of what's owned at the moment in terms of the media and business and influence on policy and politics. And so I've come to the realization that actually it comes back to the individual. It comes back to that advice that my dad gave, and I'm not just saying this because I might share this with him at some point, because I give him plenty of flack on other things anyway. So, but just
Yeah.
reflecting on that now, pretty solid advice, because I think the chat that we're having now, I
Yeah.
think the chat that we've been having at work, we did Holocaust Memorial Day, we marked it yesterday, and we marked that within its own right, and that comes under my work. And obviously, people are trying to think, well, what does this mean for Gaza in Palestine? I'm like, well, let's just focus on that and understand what happened there. The chap came on our team and he talked about his own family experiences there. And you couldn't help bringing some of the stuff up. Well, that's exactly what's happening now. Exactly. And back then, people would have been probably less sympathetic to the Jewish community then, because of the way things are now. Ironically, now it's happening somewhere else. So we see the direct link, but the lessons, have they been learned or not? And not everybody is kind of, there's all a whole diverse mix of, but in the mainstream media, that seems to be one narrative. So I've come to understand that it does come back to everyday people understanding each other. We talk about everyone matters at work, and I talk about that quite a bit. And someone challenged me on that, actually, because when I came up with that, I didn't know everyone matters. And someone said there's a sort of movement in America where they say all life matters, in trying to counteract the Black Lives Matter movement. And I thought, okay. And I thought perhaps we shouldn't talk about that. I thought, well, that's not where we're coming from. But when you look at every individual and we look at what challenges they have, I have this wheel of privilege or underprivilege. And when you look through that, someone can be underprivileged because they're from a socially deprived background. They might be a carer, they might be neurodiverse, they might all these other experiences. And actually, I could be very similar to yourself, Andrew, in some of the stuff that we've been through, but just the religion or race might be different. But we're probably more connected, and we don't know it, than someone, like I said, that kid at school that I thought was my mate. Um, I don't hold him anything against him, by the way. He wanted to play, good guy, bad guy. But when we look at that, we have more that connects us, that doesn't. And I think about the 80-20 rule, 80% of the challenge are common all the way through: respect, understanding each other, you know, and that 20% is nuanced. Specific groups have this specific sentiment to another. But I think sometimes we try and solve everything. I think if organizations, schools, communities, religious kind of communities, the workplace a lot in terms of well-being and ED&I, focus on that kind of commonality, that intersectionality, I think we solve a lot of issues. Like most things, you start to see that exponential benefit of what you're doing, that sort of halo effect as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. We are so connected. I think for me personally, this is my own personal view, that the biggest determining factor of disparity, privilege, disadvantage is actually class
Mhm.
and generational wealth rather than your gender, your culture. And that those are the things that will determine whether truly
Yeah, yeah.
someone has those privileges or not. So I think that, and I think that's really important. We remember across cultures, across genders, that we are connected. There are a very, very small group of hyper wealthy elites who have an awful lot of control. And actually, the rest of us, we are connected. We are on each other's wavelength, and to try work together better. The advice
Mhm.
that your dad gave you, I do love that, focusing on doing what you do well and being kind and respectful, so you can be your own beacon of light. There's a growing effect, which is really great. Do you obviously you work within construction now, within organizational development, in developing people in the organization, very much within construction. I know you've been site based as well as part of your journey there. Um, the men that you serve at Amey, sorry,
Mhm.
within you, because it's Amey that they're your overall employer, aren't they? Do
That's
you
right.
think there's a greater awareness now around some of these, but psychological safety? So leaders creating an environment where people are safe to speak up, challenge, and they're not going to be penalized if they talk about their struggles. Do you think there's greater awareness that actually, as men, we shouldn't just have it, think we've got it all sewn up and, talk about stuff? Is that changing from what you see within the world of construction?
Yeah, so I've been with Amy quite some time now, and the TRU project is an alliance of various other major players, Network Rail, Nuttall, Siemens, Arup, etc. Um, and I'll talk about Amy. The journey I've seen Amy go on has been phenomenal, and I think that's um, there's a lot more to do with well-being now out there. There's a lot more to do with sort of ED&I out there and be inclusive. The gender pay gap, expectations, things like that starting to come into play. I think the public sector expectations as part of looking at contracts in terms of social value expectations, and now they're increasing environmental awareness and KPIs and that type of thing. And that's just taken a new step in terms of ESG, they call it, environmental sustainability governance. So within that period, now where we are at Amy is actually it's amazing. There's these employee networks of different groups. They all talk to each other. There's different leadership programs tailored for women, or if you're from a multicultural background, which I think is fantastic. Now this may happen in other industries elsewhere. Construction industry, sometimes public sector is sometimes a bit behind. So I can only really talk about that's been predominantly my post-university sort of experience. But for that sort of area, it's amazing, and very much the talk is about men's health, everyone's well-being. What do women need? What are the different populations? And it all seems to center around our people, and that our people are the center of us achieving what we need to achieve. And I think the penny has really dropped within Amy and other organizations as well. So I think it's a really exciting time. But I think at the same time, um, expectations of the younger generation coming through has completely changed. I look at some of these guys and I'm in awe of them because they won't keep quiet,
Interesting.
or the majority of them keep quiet if they feel strongly about something. They're happy to challenge. Quite senior people, as I would have been. Like, well, we've been growing up as part of that. Respect your elders. And as part of that, you get confused in terms of can't challenge them. That type of thing. People of authority. And actually, it's not a bad thing. This is a good thing that they're part of that conversation. And it's quite changing all the time as well with the change in technology. So I think um, pe- companies are actually on the front foot meeting their own population's needs in terms of getting the work done and actually their customers. But bringing back that around, going back to our previous point, the people that have brought that change around have actually come from within the organization at all levels and across the whole spectrum of diversity. And I've seen that. So those people saying, wouldn't it be good if we had this? And this isn't quite working, and this is what we need to improve. And it's not always easy in such a large organization to make that change. but that resilience around going for something when it's right and doing it in a positive way. And there are occasions where that doesn't happen, and everyone makes mistakes, but then reflecting on that and moving forward. And again, I think it's coming back to, sometimes I think people think this large organization, something's going to happen automatically. Things are going to fall in place. And that does sometimes happen, but actually it's people coming together. I think that's really powerful. And as we're seeing our previous sort of conversation about what's happening on the world stage at the moment in time, I think, I've been pro-Palestinian since I saw that video, over 25 years ago type of thing. And I wouldn't talk about it previously. Absolutely, I wouldn't talk about it because people's understanding of it, and people's understanding was, this is a right for, this is a Jewish homeland. It was too sensitive around that because of what happened in World War II. But actually, that's all fine. But there's this, real kind of things that are happening where people are not aware of it. And if you talk to them, there's too much work and too much kind of trying to get people to understand it. And now people talk openly about it. People talk rationally about it. They're looking at the facts. And I think that then people, that understanding coming together, and I've seen that with different groups as well, coming together of all backgrounds. It's not just a kind of Arab thing or a Muslim thing. It is people actually going, hold on, if this is happening elsewhere, it could be us tomorrow, it could be that group, or we've seen it happen with all these other countries or these sort of ethnicities before, these certain groups. So all of this is kind of links back to this, the same kind of reasons, the root causes, and I think people are starting to understand and be more kind of open around that. So yeah, definitely it's kind of people, again, coming back, understanding each other and supporting each other. That's made that difference.
And that's presumably how you would see, we know that a lot of the data points to men and boys struggling. In fact, only this last week, Cambridge University Press and Assessment had led some research that showed that across all subjects, girls outperform boys across the education system, with the exception of maths. And yet the one conclusion from this research is we need to do more to get women into STEM, the fact they're not performing so well in maths. And yet very little said about actually boys are underperforming within education across the board. So actually, what's the impact of that on society? We know that then some people would say, yeah, but once boys get into the workplace, they soar like they've got wings like eagles, and they leap forward financially. But then again, some data was coming out on the fact that by the age of 30, 5% of 30-year-old women still live with their parents, but 15% of men still live with their parents. We know in terms of suicide, 3/4 of people that die by suicide are men.
The industry is one of the worst for suicide.
Yeah. Well. So clearly there are issues, there are challenges for men and boys. I feel the media miss a lot of those and just sort of skate over them. That's my own opinion. How do we address some of these issues? What do we need to do for our men and boys? What's going on there in your opinion?
Within Amey, it was the leading point was women, focusing on women. But what was nice to see was that the women actually have been instrumental in saying we need a multicultural development program. We need to develop our early careers more. And I know on our project, local employment in the north, and those deprived areas. So actually, we need to work together on this, because what benefits them benefits men and the other way around. So again, it comes back to that point. And I think sometimes people get into this us versus them. And I always give this example. You sit in a meeting and someone says white, pale, and stale, or something like that. And it makes me cringe, because I think I'm not of that view. I don't want someone to just say that, I take each person for their own merit, and that comes from a religious kind of perspective as well. Each person is taking their own merit. So what we need to do is actually look at all of the areas equally, men, women. What are the challenges? And they'll be different sometimes for different industries. You can't solve the world. Sometimes it's picking, what are the 2 or 3 priority areas, tackling that, and then moving forward. And you see those big barriers break away. And I think definitely men need to be considered included within that, because we talked about that wheel, the wheel of privilege or lack of privilege. And whilst, men do have the front foot, statistically speaking, compared to women, because of representation at senior levels. And you don't always see that. There's a lot of people who stay at the same level, a lot of people who don't actually make it through. So it needs to be more nuanced. I think that's just touching on
Yeah.
it. Again, talking about some of ethnic minority background, religious background. Sometimes then those odds are sometimes stacked against you, for you in terms of resilience and things like that, for you in terms of some of those networks that sometimes don't exist, growing up and that type of thing. But then against you in terms of English isn't necessarily your first language growing up, and that statistically can cause you, even though people may be articulating themselves fine at that point, their face doesn't fit, as you know, whatever that kind of means in all its kind of complexities of that. So it's more than just kind of go, well, you're a man, you're going to be fine. Because actually, sometimes, and I've seen actually, particularly in the people space, and I hope the ladies don't mind me saying this, actually, it's easier if you're a white female. I've seen that with my own eyes, because there's more white females in that space.
Yeah.
So they support each other, generally speaking, and it's easier. Whereas, I might come in, and although nobody's got any bad intentions, but I can see, you can feel the vibe sometimes. There's a bloke in the room, type of thing, or and naturally, I might speak a bit louder and make them across a bit more dominant, whatever it might be. I might be generally sometimes a little less chatty in terms of small talk. How are you? How's your kids? And that we generally do that, but I think sometimes it's a bit more sort of natural. I think for women, and they're a bit better than that. I think at men. So there's sort of different levels of it.
Well, there's two things being in the minority anywhere, 15% primary school teachers are male. So if you're a male primary school teacher and you're in the minority, we know that whether it's cultural, gender minority, class minority, it's really easy to, when you're in the minority, get this sense of imposter syndrome. Even if there's nothing rational to back that up, even if the people around you are very welcoming, you feel like, do I belong? There's a spotlight on me. So I think that is, being in the minority in any context is a challenge, just how we manage ourselves. I really like the point you raise, and I'm really encouraged that actually you've said within your organization, women are calling for a much more sort of 360 approach that encompasses all the different groups. And I think that's, for me, where we can really make progress as men, women, people, where, just as men, we should be calling out the dividers, the haters, the Andrew Tates, the ridiculous things that they say, and say, no, not on our watch. That does not, also, ladies, please do the same for us. Let's look out for one another. Let's support one another. And my own little mantra that I've got is every pound we invest for male welfare is a pound for the women that love those men. And every pound we invest for female welfare is a pound for the men that love those women. We are all in the same boat, and we can all raise each other, if that makes sense.
That's right. Yeah, there's a chap I followed on LinkedIn. His name's Sal. I've forgotten his surname, unfortunately. He's quite prominent in the ED&I space, and he always hashtags his LinkedIn posts as "We rise when we lift each other."
Yeah,
and I really like that. I wish I'd come up with that, because I think it's great. And I think you make a good point there in terms of the pound aspect of it. But the reality is, the more comfortable, psychologically safe someone feels, the more kind of included that they feel. And you're going to want to do, it's natural human behavior. You want to lift others. You want to be more inclusive of others. People tend to go on the defensive when they don't feel comfortable. They don't feel like they belong. They feel like they're being targeted, or things aren't easy. That's unfortunately when people tend to get a bit defensive, as we've seen. The majority of people actually want to see people have equality, want everyone to do well, whether they realize that or not, actually. And I think the behavior as humans, whether we like it or not, we do have a lot of sheep mentality. Psychological studies. We follow our leaders, we follow groups, and if it's positive, then we follow and we help each other out. And if it's not, I see it can, get quite bad quite quickly, with some of the examples we've talked about, the Holocaust or Palestine, the Uyghurs in China, or whatever it might be. Yeah.
So just to conclude, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. If you could give a message of brief encouragement for the people listening to this podcast, or the men and boys particularly listening to this podcast, what would you say to them in a couple of sentences, your sort of concluding message?
I think we're all ambassadors for ourselves and for each other. We have a higher purpose, whether we realize that or not. So I think in today's world, there's a lot of challenges in terms of information overload, social media.
Yeah.
Try and take some of that space out to find out what's your purpose. It's a big question. Ask people that what's their purpose, but whatever that you enjoy, whatever good you want to see in the world, whatever legacy you want to live, you start to think about that, follow that. When things get difficult, or when things are good as well, just wake up in the morning thinking that's that person I want to be today. That's what I want to achieve. There's going to be peer pressure from your mates. You want to look cool, or at work. Sometimes, what if I say this? What if I do that? But what you soon start to find is if you do things in the right way, you do the behavior, the mind follows actually,
Yeah.
and people slowly start to follow the right way. And it can each person is doing small steps at a time. I think we can't wake up one day and think, "Oh, I've just got to, crap the world with the whole team." You can think that, but sometimes it can be a bit more challenging than that. So that drip effect, I think people underestimate that sort of slow change over time. But when everyone does it, it's powerful. It's cumulative.
Brilliant. No, I love that as a message. I love the use of the word ambassador. And I suppose that could be a different question. If you ask someone what's your purpose, I might find that a difficult question, but that could be a different way of asking that same question, couldn't it? What are you going to be an ambassador for? What are you going to champion? I like that that's a really good way to end. I like the use of the word ambassador. And the absolute last question, so where can people find you and get in contact with you if they want to talk to you more, connect with you? How can they do that?
Yeah. So I'm not one for much sort of more social media and that type of thing, but I've started to use LinkedIn a bit more. I wanted to understand the world a bit better, just myself. So I was receiving information, but now I tend to put a few more posts up and that type of thing. So I think looking for me on LinkedIn is
Okay,
probably the
LinkedIn.
best way. Drop me a
Fab.
message, like one of the posts that you think resonates, and get behind that kind of movement. Start to put some of these positive messages out there so that we have that cumulative effect as well. So yeah, it's probably the best way, Andrew.
Brilliant. So it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Andrew. It's been a pleasure.